By the summer of 1940, the German Wehrmacht was not merely an army. It was an elemental force, a perfect, terrifying machine that had redefined modern warfare. The myth of its invincibility was not propaganda. It was a conclusion drawn from a series of stunning, lightning-fast victories that had left the world breathless and reeling. To understand the profound impact of the hidden killer, one must first appreciate the absolute zenith of German power it was designed to destroy. This was the age of blitzkrieg, and it seemed nothing could stand in its path. The fall of Poland in 1939 was dismissed by many in the West as a foregone conclusion. But the campaign that erupted in the West in May 1940 was a shock of seismic proportions. It was here that the blitzkrieg, the lightning war, was perfected. It was a symphony of coordinated violence, a new form of combat that bypassed the static slaughter of the First World War and replaced it with dynamic, paralyzing speed. The panzer divisions were its spearhead. Columns of PZ, KPFW, 3 and 4 tanks, not overwhelmingly superior in armor or firepower individually, but used in a revolutionary way, became the sledgehammer that shattered Allied lines. They did not engage in protracted battles. They punched holes. They flowed through weak points like water, bypassing strong points and resistance centers, driving deep into the enemy's rear. Their objective was not to destroy the enemy army piece by piece, but to sever its nervous system, its command and control, its supply lines, its will to fight. Supporting this armored thrust was the Luftwaffe, the most powerful and sophisticated air force in the world. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber was not just an aircraft. It was a psychological weapon. Its screaming sirens became the soundtrack of the blitzkrieg, heralding destruction from above. Stukas functioned as flying artillery, pinpointing and obliterating strongpoints, communications hubs, and troop concentrations ahead of the panzer advance. Meanwhile, Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters swept the skies clear of Allied aircraft, establishing air superiority that made the German advance unchallenged from above. Behind the spearhead came the relentless infantry, moving in trucks and on foot to consolidate the gains, mop up bypass pockets, and secure the flanks. The entire system was fueled by superb training, initiative at the junior officer level, and flawless radio communication that allowed for real-time coordination between air and ground forces. The results were breathtaking and horrifying. In a matter of 6 weeks, the German war machine accomplished what the Kaiser's army had failed to do in 4 years of brutal warfare. The Netherlands fell in 5 days. Belgium was overrun. The British Expeditionary Force, along with remnants of the French army, was hurled into the sea at Dunkirk, saved only by a miraculous evacuation that left all their heavy equipment behind. On June 22, 1940, France, the nation with what was considered the finest army in Europe, signed an armistice in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. The humiliation was complete. By mid-1941, the myth was at its absolute peak. The Balkans had been crushed. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Corps was driving the British back towards Egypt. And most significantly, in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched, the largest invasion in human history. The Soviet Union, caught utterly by surprise, seemed on the verge of total collapse. Millions of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured in massive Kesselschlacht, cauldron battles. The panzer groups advanced hundreds of miles, closing in on Leningrad, Moscow, and the oil-rich Caucasus. To a neutral observer, the victory of the Third Reich seemed not just possible, but inevitable. This was the myth of invincibility. It was built on speed, shock, and a seemingly unstoppable combination of air and armored power. Germany appeared to have unlocked the secret to swift, decisive, and total victory. Its economy, though geared for war, was not yet on a true total war footing because its leadership believed the war would be short. The resources of a conquered continent, French factories, Scandinavian or Balkan oil, were now feeding the German war machine. The Reich stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow. It was an empire, powerful, confident, and seemingly unassailable. But this very strength contained the seeds of its own destruction. The Blitzkrieg was a magnificent tactical instrument, but it was not a strategy for a long war of attrition. It was a rapier designed for a quick kill. And as the vastness of Russia swallowed the German advance and the British Empire refused to surrender, the war transformed. Germany now faced a protracted conflict, a war of production and endurance. And in this new kind of war, the brilliant, visible power of the panzers and Stukas would be rendered increasingly irrelevant by a hidden, unglamorous, and utterly ruthless killer that was already beginning to stalk them. The myth was about to collide with a brutal, silent reality. While the world watched the blinding flashes of the Blitzkrieg, a different, quieter, and ultimately more decisive war was being declared. It was a war not of tanks and dive bombers, but of statistics, shipping manifests, and raw materials. This was the economic war, and for Great Britain, standing alone after the fall of France, it was the only war they could still wage. They could not hope to launch a cross-channel invasion for years. They could not stop the German advance in Russia. But they could attempt to strangle the German war machine, to slowly constrict its supply of lifeblood until the mighty Wehrmacht, for all its tactical brilliance, simply ran out of fuel. This unseen front would become the decisive battlefield of the Second World War. The fundamental vulnerability of the German economy, despite its fearsome military output, was its profound and chronic lack of key strategic resources. Germany had excellent engineers, skilled workers, and efficient factories. What it did not have was oil, rubber, and a sufficient supply of high-grade metals like nickel, chromium, and tungsten, essential for armor-piercing shells and advanced engine components. The Reich was resource-poor. Its war economy was a magnificent engine running on borrowed fuel, dependent on a fragile web of imports to sustain itself. Before the war, these vital supplies had flowed overland from the Soviet Union under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or by sea from neutral nations. The invasion of Russia in June 1941 slammed the door on the first source. This left the sea lanes as the critical artery. Swedish iron ore came down the coast of Norway. Wolfram from Portugal and Spain, oil from the Romanian Ploiești fields, which still needed to be transported by coastal tanker, and a host of other materials all traveled on the water. The German economy was, in essence, an island economy, utterly dependent on merchant shipping. This was its Achilles heel. Recognizing this, the British and later the Americans devised a multi-pronged strategy to attack this vulnerability. The first and most traditional weapon was the surface blockade. The Royal Navy's home fleet patrolled the exits from the North Sea, interdicting merchant ships trying to run the gauntlet. But this was a tactic from the age of sail, and it had limited effect against the coastal traffic of occupied Europe and the neutral trade that slipped through. The second weapon was strategic bombing. The Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, and later the United States Army Air Forces, embarked on a colossal campaign to destroy German industry from the air. They targeted synthetic oil plants, ball-bearing factories, and aircraft production lines. The effects were significant, but they were also costly, slow to materialize, and subject to the vagaries of weather, enemy defenses, and bombing inaccuracy. In 1941 and 1942, the bombs were falling, but they were not yet a war-winning weapon. The third and most devastating weapon was the one that operated in the shadows, the submarine. If Germany's lifeline was its merchant fleet, then the goal was to send that fleet to the bottom. This was the core tenet of the Allied economic war plan. It was a strategy of attrition, a grim accounting of tonnage sunk versus tonnage built. The objective was to sink merchant ships faster than German shipyards, and the captured yards of Europe could replace them. It was a simple equation, but its execution would be complex and brutal. This unseen front was a war of numbers waged by men in offices in London and Washington, studying graphs of shipping losses and production figures. They understood that Germany did not need to be defeated in a single, climactic battle. It needed to be bled dry over time. Every tanker sunk in the North Atlantic meant less fuel for training pilots or running Panzer engines. Every freighter carrying rubber that was sent to the bottom meant fewer tires for trucks on the Eastern Front. Every carrier lost meant a slowdown in steel production. The responsibility for waging this subsurface war fell initially and almost exclusively to the Royal Navy. But Britain's resources were stretched to the breaking point. Its own merchant fleet was being ravaged by German U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic. It needed a partner, an industrial power with the shipbuilding capacity and the naval might to take the fight to the enemy's doorstep on a scale previously unimaginable. That partner was the United States. Even before its formal entry into the war, through the Lend-Lease program, America was becoming the arsenal of democracy. And with the attack on Pearl Harbor, its immense industrial and military potential was fully unleashed. The unseen front was about to receive a massive, decisive reinforcement. The stage was set for the hidden killer to emerge from the depths, not as a lone predator, but as a coordinated pack, backed by the full might of American industry and intelligence. The economic war, once a desperate British holding action, was about to escalate into a systematic campaign of annihilation. To comprehend the destructive power of the Allied submarine campaign, one must first understand its target. This was not a war focused solely on warships or military installations. The primary target, the object of a relentless, years-long hunt, was the mundane, unglamorous, and utterly essential merchant vessel. These ships were the circulatory system of the German war economy, and the commodities they carried were its lifeblood. Each tanker, freighter, and/or carrier was a vital cell carrying oxygen to the body of the Wehrmacht. The Allied strategy was one of systematic anemia. The most critical of these resources, the one upon which all others depended, was oil. Warfare in the industrial age ran on fossil fuels. The panzer divisions that had executed the Blitzkrieg were not just machines of steel and fire. They were machines of consumption. A single Panzer IV consumed roughly 1 gallon of fuel every half-mile. The vast fleets of trucks that supplied the infantry, the locomotives that moved troops and material across the continent, and, most critically, the aircraft of the Luftwaffe all thirsted for a constant, massive supply of petroleum. Without it, the most powerful army in the world would be reduced to a stationary, silent, and helpless force. Germany's domestic oil production was negligible. It relied on two primary sources: the synthetic fuel plants, which used the complex and resource-intensive Bergius process to turn coal into gasoline, and the natural oil fields of Ploiești in Romania. Both were vulnerable. The synthetic plants were large, fixed targets, increasingly susceptible to Allied bombing. The oil from Ploiești had to travel. While some moved via pipeline and barge, a significant portion, especially the refined products like aviation gasoline, was transported by coastal tankers through the Black Sea, the Aegean, and up the Adriatic or through the Mediterranean to Italian ports before being transshipped across Europe. This maritime route was a critical choke point. Every tanker sunk was not just a loss of ship. It was the equivalent of destroying a small, mobile refinery, eliminating thousands of tons of fuel before it could ever reach a German engine. Alongside oil, a host of other vital materials kept the war machine functioning. Iron, ore, predominantly from Sweden, was the raw material for the steel that built tanks, guns, and submarines. This ore traveled on a predictable route from the Swedish port of Luleå down the Baltic coast and into German ports. While this route was largely protected in the early war, it represented a massive volume of material absolutely essential for production. Then there were the lesser-known but equally critical ferroalloy metals. These were the elements that transformed ordinary steel into the high-grade alloys needed for advanced warfare. Nickel, primarily from Finland and later seized stocks in France, was essential for armor plate and gun barrels. Chromium, from Turkey, was vital for making steel hard and resistant to corrosion. Tungsten, or wolfram, from Portugal and Spain, was irreplaceable for manufacturing the cores of armor-piercing shells and high-speed cutting tools used in factories. Without a steady flow of these metals, the quality of German armaments would plummet. Tanks would become more vulnerable, shells would shatter on impact, and production lines would slow. Finally, there was rubber. The synthetic rubber, Buna, industry, like the synthetic fuel program, was a testament to German chemical ingenuity, but it was never able to fully meet the staggering demands of a continental war. Tires for trucks, aircraft, and armored vehicles, seals for engines, hoses for fuel lines, and countless other components required rubber. Natural rubber, smuggled from the Far East on blockade runners or sourced from stockpiles, remained crucial. A shortage of rubber meant immobility, grounding the very forces that relied on speed. The German merchant fleet and the ships of occupied nations pressed into its service were the vessels that carried this lifeblood. They were the logistical backbone of the entire Nazi war effort. The Allied strategists, looking at their charts and intelligence reports, saw a simple, brutal equation. The German economy required X million tons of imports per month to function at peak capacity. Their goal was to ensure that less than X arrived. It was a war of arithmetic. They did not need to sink every ship. They only needed to sink enough to push the German war economy into deficit. They had to create a slow, insidious drain that would, over time, weaken the entire organism. The panzers in Russia, the U-boats in the Atlantic, the fighters over Germany. They were all connected by this invisible maritime supply chain. The submarine campaign was not a sideshow. It was an attempt to sever the spinal cord of the German military. The hunters were not aiming for the muscle and bone of the army, but for the veins and arteries that kept it alive. In the vast, industrial tapestry of the American war machine, the Gatto-class submarine was not the most glamorous thread. It was not the sleek, publicized symbol of power like the B-17 Flying Fortress, nor did it possess the dramatic, visible impact of a Sherman tank column. Its birth was one of function over form, a response to a specific and brutal strategic necessity. Yet this vessel and its successors would become the hidden killer, the single most effective platform in the systematic strangulation of Japan. Its devastating power, however, was not born from a single revolutionary breakthrough, but from the masterful integration of proven, robust technologies into a perfectly balanced weapon system. The Gatto class was the embodiment of American industrial pragmatism. Designed in the late 1930s and rushed into production after Pearl Harbor, it was a fleet boat intended to operate alongside the battle fleet, a doctrine that would quickly become obsolete. But the design's inherent strengths made it supremely adaptable to the war of attrition it would actually fight. At over 300 feet long and displacing 1,500 tons on the surface, it was large enough for the vast distances of the Pacific. Its range was staggering, 11,000 nautical miles, allowing it to patrol off the very coast of Japan itself. Its endurance was measured not in days, but in months, with standard patrols lasting 75 days, a testament to its habitability and storage capacity. The boat's power came from a straightforward diesel-electric system. From massive diesel engines propelled it on the surface at a brisk 20 knots and charged its enormous battery banks. When submerged, electric motors took over, providing silent, if slower, propulsion for stealthy approaches and evasion. This combination gave it the strategic mobility to reach its hunting grounds and the tactical flexibility to operate within them. But the true genius of the Gatto class and the later nearly identical Belau and Tinch classes was its sensor and weapon suite. It was in essence a mobile ambush platform, and its tools for finding and killing the enemy were relentlessly refined. Its eyes were radar. The SJ surface search radar, and later the more advanced SJ-1 and ST radars, allowed the submarine to see through fog, darkness, and rain squalls. It could detect a ship's masthead miles beyond the visual horizon, giving the skipper a monumental tactical advantage. He could track a convoy, plot its course and speed, and maneuver for an ideal attack position while remaining completely invisible. At night or in poor weather, the American submarine was a ghost with perfect vision, while its Japanese prey sailed blind. Its ears were sonar. While primarily used for detecting enemy destroyers during depth charge attacks and for navigation, The JK passive sonar array allowed skilled operators to listen for the faint screw noises of distant ships, providing another layer of long-range detection. And then there were its teeth, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, and a reliable 4 or 5-inch deck gun. The torpedo, specifically the Mark 14, was intended to be its primary killing instrument. As detailed in the agonizing saga of its failures, this weapon was nearly its undoing. But once the flaws of the magnetic and contact exploders were diagnosed and brutally engineered out, the Mark 14 became a reliable and deadly munition. The boat could carry up to 24 torpedoes, allowing for multiple engagements on a single patrol. The deck gun, often seen as a secondary weapon, became crucial for finishing off damaged or small vessels, conserving precious torpedoes for larger game. What made this combination of hull, engine, sensor, and weapon so devastating was the crew. The U.S. submarine service was an all-volunteer force, and it attracted some of the Navy's most independent and aggressive minds. The commanding officer of a submarine on patrol was a sovereign entity, a captain in the most absolute sense of the word. He was given an area and a mission, and the decisions of life, death, and victory were his alone. This command climate fostered incredible initiative and tactical innovation. Men like Mush Morton, Dudley Mush Morton, and Richard O'Kane didn't just follow doctrine. They rewrote it with relentless aggression. The hidden killer was not born from a secret weapon, but from a perfect synergy. It was the combination of a long-legged, habitable boat, the game-changing advantage of radar, a reliable, powerful torpedo, and, most importantly, the audacious spirit of the men who manned it. It was a system designed not for a single, glorious battle, but for a long, merciless campaign of commerce destruction. It could find the enemy in the dark, stalk him with impunity, and strike with lethal force. While the world watched the carrier duels and island invasions, these gray wolves were slipping into the sea lanes, becoming the embodiment of a simple, devastating truth. A nation that cannot protect its trade will perish. The hidden killer was born, and it was headed for Japan's throat. The concept of the wolf pack did not originate with the Americans. It was a tactic famously and devastatingly employed by German U-boat commander Karl Donitz in the Battle of the Atlantic. His brutal tactic groups of U-boats had nearly strangled Great Britain. For the U.S. submarine force, struggling with faulty torpedoes and a doctrine of individual patrols, the Wolfpack represented a potential force multiplier, a way to overwhelm Japanese convoy escorts and inflict catastrophic damage. The early American experiments with this tactic, however, were a story of mixed results, a proof of concept achieved not through flawless execution, but through raw aggression and a dawning realization of its terrifying potential, even with hobbled weapons. The first official U.S. Wolfpack, codenamed Joe, sortied in October in 1943. It consisted of 3 submarines, Ciro, Shad, and Greyback, under the command of Captain Charles B. Swede Mommsen. Mommsen, a brilliant innovator, he developed the Mommsen lung escape device, was an ideal choice to test this new tactical doctrine. The pack's mission was to penetrate the East China Sea and disrupt the dense Japanese shipping lanes. The results of Joe's patrol were not a tally of massive tonnage sunk, but they were strategically profound. The pack demonstrated that coordinated radio communication between submarines was possible, that they could effectively sweep a large area, and that their presence created chaos and dispersal among Japanese convoys. They proved the wolf pack could exist, even if its bite was still blunted by the ongoing torpedo crisis. It was the second wolf pack, Roach, comprising halibut, haddow, and tullibee, that provided the first real sting. Under Commander John C. Bay Broach on the halibut, the pack aggressively engaged a convoy, with haddow sinking 2 ships. While the results were modest, the aggressive, multi-boat attack confirmed the tactical advantage of coordinated assault. The Japanese escorts, designed to counter a single submarine, were utterly confounded by simultaneous attacks from different directions. The Hunter had become a coordinator of hunters. But the true coming-of-age story of the American wolf pack, the moment it shed its experimental skin and revealed its true, brutal nature was the patrol of Mickey's Max in November 1943. Led by the already legendary commander Mush Morton in the USS Wahoo, the pack included the USS Sawfish and USS Pompano. Morton was the archetype of the aggressive American skipper, bold, relentless, and utterly confident. His philosophy was simple: get close and sink everything. It was on this patrol, however, that tragedy intersected with tactical evolution. Wahoo, attempting to transit the La Parao Strait, was detected and depth-charged by Japanese anti-submarine forces. On October 11, 1943, one of the most successful submarines in the U.S. Navy was lost with all hands, including the irreplaceable Morton. His loss was a devastating blow to the entire force. Yet, the Wolfpack tactic he helped pioneer did not die with him. In fact, his legacy of aggression became its guiding spirit. Other packs, with names like Pete's Peppers and Don's Devils, began to roam the Philippine Sea and the South China Sea. As the torpedo fixes began to take hold in late 1943 and early 1944, the effectiveness of these packs skyrocketed. The early stings were becoming deep, lethal wounds. The mechanics of a successful Wolfpack attack were a masterpiece of naval choreography. Using intelligence derived from decoded Japanese messages, a supreme Allied advantage known as Ultra, a pack would be directed to a specific convoy route. The boats would form a scouting line, spaced miles apart, to maximize the chance of initial contact. The first submarine to spot the smoke or radar signatures of the convoy would radio the contact report to the pack commander, who would then vector the other boats into attack positions. The ideal scenario was a coordinated night surface attack. Under the cover of darkness, the submarines, with their low silhouettes and superior radar, were nearly invisible. One boat, often the pack leader, would make an end-around run, using its surface speed to get ahead of the convoy's path. Another would attack from the flank, while a third would lie in wait astern to pick off any stragglers or damaged ships. When the commander gave the order, they would strike simultaneously. The effect on a Japanese convoy was pandemonium. Escort captains would hear torpedoes hitting ships on multiple sides at once. Their sonar would be useless against surface attacks, and the radar of Japanese escorts was primitive compared to the American SJ radar. They would be forced to make impossible choices: chase one submarine, leaving the others free to slaughter the merchantman, or try to defend the convoy as a whole, thereby defending nothing effectively. The darkness would be lit by the flames of exploding tankers, the air filled with the screams of rending metal and the desperate, confused radio traffic of the escorts. These early Wolfpack successes proved two critical things. First, they demonstrated that the sum of three submarines was far greater than their individual parts. A lone boat could harass a convoy. A Wolfpack could annihilate it. Second, and more importantly, they shattered the confidence of the Japanese merchant marine and its protectors. The sea lanes were no longer a calculated risk. They had become a killing ground. The early stings of 1943, though often hampered by the last vestiges of the torpedo scandal, had proven the formula. Now, with reliable torpedoes, better radar, and a growing cadre of aggressive commanders schooled in this new doctrine, the Wolfpacks were ready to be unleashed in earnest. The period of experimentation was over. The season of the slaughter was about to begin. The American submarine campaign did not succeed through courage and torpedoes alone. Its transformation from a campaign of frustration into one of history's most effective naval blockades was engineered in laboratories, in code-breaking rooms, and on the drawing boards of engineers. A silent revolution in technology and intelligence, operating far from the perilous waters of the Pacific, provided the submarine force with an unassailable advantage, turning the vast ocean from a hiding place for the enemy into a transparent killing field. This was the tide turning, not on the whim of battle, but through the deliberate application of superior information and sensing. The single most transformative piece of technology was radar. While the submarines had carried radar since the early war, its evolution was relentless. The early sets were limited in range and resolution. The introduction of the SJ surface search radar, and later the more advanced SJ-1 and ST radars, gave American submarines a supernatural sense of sight. They could now detect a ship's masthead at over 20,000 yards, far beyond the visual horizon. They could see through the pitch black of a moonless night and the dense fog of the Formosa Strait. This advantage was absolute. A Japanese convoy, sailing blind, would be unaware that its position, course, and speed were being meticulously tracked by an invisible predator lurking just over the horizon. The American skipper could take his time, plotting the perfect intercept course without ever raising his periscope, preserving his stealth until the final lethal moment. This radar advantage was compounded by a corresponding weakness in Japanese technology. Japanese radar, when it was present on escorts, was primitive, short-ranged, and unreliable. More critically, the Japanese never developed an effective radar detector. American submarines were equipped with the April 1st radar warning receiver, nicknamed the Foxer, which could pick up the emissions of a searching Japanese radar, giving the submarine ample warning that an escort was scanning in time to dive or evade. The Japanese had no such system. They sailed in electronic silence, unable to see and unaware that they were being watched. The technological gap was a chasm, but radar only found target. Another innovation ensured the torpedo would hit it, the Torpedo Data Computer, TDC. This was an electromechanical analog computer, a masterpiece of pre-digital engineering located in the attack center. The TDC automatically and continuously calculated the firing solution for a torpedo attack. As the sonar and radar operators fed in data on the target's range, bearing, and speed, the TDC would solve the complex trigonometry of the intercept course, constantly updating the gyro angles for the torpedoes. This took the immense mental strain off the fire control party and allowed for remarkably accurate shots, even while maneuvering evasively. It was the brain that made the boat's teeth so precise. However, the ultimate force multiplier, the asset that elevated the entire campaign from tactical success to strategic inevitability, was intelligence, specifically the Allied breaking of the Japanese naval codes. The operation, known collectively as Ultra, was the war's best-kept secret. Codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor and elsewhere painstakingly decrypted Japanese naval messages, revealing a breathtaking amount of strategic information. Through Ultra, American commanders knew what the Japanese planned to do before they did it. Submarine force commanders like Admiral Charles Lockwood in Pearl Harbor received decrypted messages detailing convoy schedules, routes, compositions, and even sometimes their intended courses and speeds. This was not mere reconnaissance. It was clairvoyance. Wolf packs were not sent to randomly patrol vast, empty oceans. They were precisely dispatched, like chess pieces, to the exact coordinates where a valuable convoy was predicted to be. They were given the name of the convoy, the number of ships, the types of cargo, and the escort strength before they even left port. The synergy between Ultra and the submarines was devastating. A classic example was the sinking of the Japanese aircraft carrier Taiho in 1944. The USS Albacore was able to intercept the fleet because Ultra had provided its general location. Similarly, the massive Tokyo Express runs to reinforce Japanese garrisons were constantly ambushed because their schedules were read like an open book. This intelligence coup also worked defensively. Ultra frequently provided information on Japanese submarine and anti-submarine patrol locations, allowing American submarines to route around danger areas and avoid ambushes. It was the perfect shield to complement the razor-sharp sword of radar, the TDC. The combination of these elements created an asymmetrical battlefield that the Japanese could never hope to level. Their convoys sailed on predictable routes, blind to their surroundings, their secrets laid bare to their enemy. The American submarines that hunted them could see in the dark, calculate killing solutions with machinic precision, and be waiting at the precise time and place for an ambush. The courage of the submariners remained the essential human element, but it was this technological and intellectual infrastructure that multiplied their courage 100-fold. The tide had turned not because the submarines had changed, but because the environment in which they fought had been engineered entirely in their favor. The ocean, for the Japanese merchant marine, was no longer a body of water. It was a transparent prison, and the hidden killers held all the keys. By 1944, the American submarine campaign had evolved from a successful hunting operation into a comprehensive, multi-layered siege. The hidden killer was no longer operating in isolation. It became the lead element in a coordinated combined arms assault that targeted the Japanese merchant marine from the surface, from the air, and from the depths. This strategic integration amplified the effects of the submarine war exponentially, transforming a campaign of attrition into a swift and terminal chokehold that systematically squeezed the economic life out of the Japanese Empire. The most natural and devastating partner to the submarine force was Allied air power. While submarines ravaged the deep-water shipping lanes, aircraft began to close the coastal routes and pen up the Japanese fleet in its own harbors. The tool for this was the aerial mine. In one of the most effective, yet least celebrated campaigns of the war, American B-29 superfortresses and naval aircraft laid massive minefields in strategic choke points like the Shimonoseki Strait, the vital waterway separating the Japanese home islands from the Asian mainland. They also mined the approaches to major ports like Singapore, Kobe, and Yokohama. These mines were sophisticated, equipped with magnetic and acoustic triggers that made them difficult to sweep. The effect was to constrict the available sea space, forcing shipping into predictable, narrow channels that were precisely where the American wolf packs were waiting. The mines themselves sank and damaged hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping, but their greater impact was as a force multiplier for the submarines, herding the remaining prey into the killer's path. Alongside mining, Allied aircraft, particularly from the fast-moving carrier task forces, began a relentless campaign against coastal shipping. As American forces island-hopped closer to Japan, land-based patrol aircraft like the PB-4Y Privateer and the PBY Catalina gained ever longer reach. They prowled the East China Sea and the waters around Formosa, hunting the smaller coastal vessels and barges that had become the last resort for inter-island logistics. A submarine was a wasteful weapon to use on a 500-ton wooden-hulled schooner. A fighter strafing run or a light bomb from a patrol plane was perfectly suited to the task. This aerial harassment further fragmented Japanese maritime traffic, destroying the small-scale, local trade that was crucial for distributing what little resources made it to the home islands. The third arm of this assault came from the surface itself. As the U.S. Navy's surface fleet achieved overwhelming dominance after the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Leyte Gulf, it began to project power directly against Japanese shipping. Surface action groups, built around destroyers and cruisers, would conduct daring raids into the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea, often at night. These Tokyo Express in reverse operations would catch convoys and individual ships completely by surprise. The gunfire from a cruiser could obliterate a merchantman in minutes, and the speed of a surface group allowed it to strike multiple targets over a wide area and escape before land-based air power could respond. These raids had a profound psychological impact, demonstrating that no Japanese waters were safe, day or night, from any element of the American military. The synergy between these forces created a noose that tightened with every passing month. A Japanese convoy leaving Singapore for the home islands had to run a gauntlet of unimaginable peril. It first had to evade submarines patrolling the open South China Sea, guided by ultra-intelligence. If it survived that, it had to navigate the minefields laid at the entrance to the Formosa Strait. As it moved up the Chinese coast, it was subject to attack from both submarines and carrier-based aircraft. Nearing Japan, it faced the threat of land-based patrol planes and the dreaded surface raiders. Finally, to reach its home port, it might have to wait for days for minesweepers to clear a path through the latest B-29 laid minefield in its harbor approach. This combined arms assault systematically dismantled the Japanese maritime infrastructure. Ports became clogged with damaged ships awaiting repairs that were impossible due to a lack of steel and machine tools. Shipyards, themselves targeted by B-29s, struggled to keep pace with losses. The average speed of a convoy slowed to a crawl due to zigzagging, poor maintenance, and the need to traverse swept channels. The efficiency of the entire system collapsed. The result was economic and industrial paralysis. Raw materials from the southern resource area simply ceased to arrive. Factories in Japan, starved of bauxite, tin, and rubber, fell silent. The most critical shortage was oil. By 1945, the massive battleship Yamato was sent on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa with only enough fuel for the outward journey, a symbolic testament to the empire's empty tanks. The Japanese Navy, the once proud combined fleet, was a fleet in being, rusting at its anchors for lack of fuel to train or sortie. Pilot training became criminally abbreviated because there was no aviation gasoline for practice flights, leading to the massacre of inexperienced pilots by battle-hardened American naval aviators. The chokehold was now absolute. The submarines had started the process by savaging the fleet in deep water. But it was the combined arms assault, the mines from above, the guns from the surface, and the relentless pressure in the littoral zones that slammed the door shut. The hidden killer had been the spearhead, but it was the combined might of the Allied forces that drove that spear deep into the heart of Japan's war-making capacity. The empire was not just being defeated. It was being systematically dismantled, its connections to the outside world and its internal cohesion severed by a coordinated assault that left no avenue of escape. The lifeblood of the empire had not merely been stanched, it had been drained completely. Beyond the dramatic narratives of torpedo hits, depth charge attacks, and burning tankers lies the true, irrefutable story of the submarine campaign's success. The cold, hard arithmetic of annihilation. The statistics of Japan's merchant fleet do not simply tell a story of loss. They document a catastrophic economic collapse in real time, a controlled demolition of an island empire's ability to sustain itself. To read these numbers is to understand the precise mechanism by which Japan was defeated, long before the atomic bombs fell. At the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Japanese merchant marine, including captured vessels, stood at approximately 6.4 million tons. This was the total capital of the empire, the fleet upon which its entire strategic gamble depended. Japanese planners knew this was a precarious position. Their war strategy was predicated on a short conflict, seizing the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, and then defending this new perimeter so fiercely that the Allies would accept a negotiated peace. The merchant fleet was the linchpin of this plan, required to shuttle resources from the southern resource area back to the factories and foundries of the home islands. The campaign against this fleet can be broken into distinct phases, each marked by a dramatic shift in the statistics. The first phase, from Pearl Harbor through most of 1943, was a period of frustration for the Americans and relative success for Japan. Despite the best efforts of U.S. submariners, sinkings were limited. In 1942, Allied forces sank roughly 1 million tons of Japanese shipping. While a significant figure, Japanese shipyards and capture vessels were able to replace a substantial portion of these losses. The net decrease in tonnage was manageable. The lifeblood was flowing, albeit with some leakage. The year 1943 marked the turning point, visible in the data. This was the period when the torpedo fixes began to take hold and Wolfpack tactics were being refined. Sinkings surged to over 2 million tons for the year. For the first time, Japanese new construction, struggling with its own material shortages, could not keep pace. The net tonnage available to Japan began a steady, irreversible decline. The line on the graph had peaked and was now bending downward. Then came 1944, the year of the kill. This was the period of the combined arms assault, with fully reliable torpedoes, perfected Wolfpacks, and the integration of ultra-intelligence and aerial mining. The numbers are staggering. In 1944 alone, Allied forces, predominantly American submarines, sank nearly 4 million tons of Japanese shipping. To put this in perspective, this was more tonnage than the entire Japanese merchant fleet possessed at the start of 1943. The average monthly sinking rate exceeded 300,000 tons. The replacement capacity of Japanese shipyards, even at their frantic peak, was utterly overwhelmed. By the end of 1944, the Japanese merchant fleet had been reduced to a phantom, a mere 2.5 million tons, and much of this was damaged, confined to port by minefields, or relegated to ineffective coastal routes. The type of ships sunk tells an even more specific story. Tankers were the highest priority target, and their losses were disproportionately high. By mid-1944, the flow of oil from the East Indies to Japan had been reduced to a trickle. Imports of crude and refined oil in 1944 were less than 10% of what they had been in 1943. The empire was running on its strategic reserves, and those were nearly gone. The same was true for ore carriers bringing in iron, bauxite, and the critical ferroalloys. The factories had raw materials in their yards, but the pipeline bringing in new stock was severed. The strategic consequence of these numbers was absolute. The victory of the Japanese army in seizing the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia became a hollow, meaningless achievement. The resources were there, in the ground and in the refineries, but they could not be transported. The empire had the body, but the submarine campaign had severed its circulatory system. The statistics translate directly into operational failures. Tanks that could not move for lack of fuel, aircraft that could not fly for lack of high-octane gasoline and spare parts, infantry divisions that were starved of ammunition and reinforcements. By the summer of 1945, on the eve of the Potsdam Conference, the Japanese merchant fleet was functionally extinct. It stood at less than 1.5 million tons, most of which was blockaded in port or consisted of small, wooden-hulled coastal craft incapable of deep water travel. Industrial production had collapsed to a fraction of its 1943 levels. The nation was facing mass starvation. The statistics do not merely record a military defeat. They document the systematic deindustrialization and the impending societal collapse of a modern state. The numbers are the final, unanswerable argument. They prove that the war was won not by a single, decisive battle, but by the relentless, month after month, ship after ship application of economic warfare, a campaign whose success is quantified in the millions of tons sent to the bottom of the Pacific. The collapse was not sudden. It was statistical, predictable, and total. The sinking of a merchant ship was not an isolated event. It was the first domino in a chain reaction of failure that rippled through the entire Japanese war machine, from the front lines to the deepest factories of the home islands. The submarine campaign did not just destroy tonnage. It systematically dismantled the complex, interconnected system that allowed Japan to wage modern war. Each tanker sent to the bottom created a fuel shortage that grounded a plane, which meant a lost battle for air superiority, which led to the loss of a base, which further constricted the shipping lanes. This was the domino effect, and by 1944, the cascade of collapse was accelerating toward total paralysis. The most critical and immediate domino to fall was oil. Without a constant, massive influx of petroleum, every other component of the military began to seize. The effects were first felt in the training programs. The once rigorous and elite Japanese naval aviation training system was gutted. By 1944, new pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 100 hours of flight time, a fraction of the training their American counterparts received. They were not just inexperienced. They were fundamentally unprepared, unable to execute complex maneuvers or navigate effectively. These green pilots were systematically slaughtered by battle-hardened American aviators in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The loss of these pilots and their aircraft was a death spiral. Fewer experienced pilots meant higher losses, which necessitated even shorter training cycles with even less fuel, producing even more vulnerable pilots. For the Imperial Japanese Navy's surface fleet, the fuel shortage was equally crippling. The great battleships and carriers, symbols of Japanese naval power, became fleet in being, trapped at their anchorages in the inland sea. They were too valuable to risk in sorties without adequate air cover, and too fuel-thirsty to operate without a guaranteed supply. Major fleet operations became rare, desperate gambles. The final mission of the super battleship Yamato in April 1945 was a stark testament to this paralysis. It was sent on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa with only enough fuel for the outward journey. The mighty combined fleet which had struck Pearl Harbor had been reduced to a static defensive force, not by enemy battleships, but by a lack of diesel oil. On the ground, the Japanese army, stretched across a vast empire from Burma to the Solomon Islands, found itself increasingly isolated and immobile. Troop transfers and reinforcements became perilous, slow, and costly. The Tokyo Express runs to Guadalcanal had been risky, but possible in 1942. By 1944, attempting to move a division from China to the Philippines was a potential death sentence for every soldier aboard the transports. Garrisons were left to wither on the vine, cut off from resupply and doomed to defeat in detail as the Allied island-hopping campaign bypassed them. A soldier's fighting spirit meant little without bullets, food, or medical supplies, all of which were going down with the ships that carried them. The second major domino was the collapse of war production. Japan's factories, which had once produced Zero fighters and artillery pieces at an impressive rate, began to stall. The supply of raw materials became sporadic, then ceased entirely. Aluminum plants, dependent on bauxite from Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, slowed their production lines. Without a steady supply of high-grade steel from, or carriers, the quality of armaments plummeted. Tanks became more vulnerable, artillery barrels wore out faster, and ship construction lagged far behind the staggering losses. The Japanese attempted a frantic dispersal of industry, moving factories underground or into remote areas, but this itself required resources and transportation that were no longer available. The industrial base was not being bombed into oblivion as efficiently as Germany's was. It was being starved into submission. This industrial starvation created a feedback loop that accelerated the collapse. Fewer new weapons meant the military could not replace losses. Fewer escort vessels and patrol aircraft meant the convoys became even more vulnerable to submarine and air attack. This led to even greater shipping losses, which further reduced the flow of raw materials, which further crippled production. The system was consuming itself. Finally, the domino effect reached the very foundation of the state, the home front and the food supply. As merchant tonnage evaporated, the government was forced to make brutal choices. Should the remaining ships carry oil for the Navy or rice for the cities? The ration for the average Japanese citizen plummeted. By 1945, urban centers faced widespread malnutrition and the threat of outright famine. The physical strength of the workforce declined, further hampering what little industrial production remained. The social contract was breaking down. The paralyzing domino effect meant that by mid-1945, Japan was a nation defeated in all but name. Its navy was immobilized. Its air force was a hollow shell filled with untrained pilots. Its army was scattered and besieged on 100 islands. Its factories were idle, and its people were starving. The hidden killer had not just sunk ships. It had triggered a cascade of systemic failures that left the Japanese empire a hollowed-out shell, utterly incapable of sustained military operations or even national survival. The war machine was not just damaged, it was paralyzed, its every component frozen in place by the simple, brutal arithmetic of sunk tonnage. The final, formal surrender was merely the acknowledgement of a physical reality that had already occurred. By the spring of 1945, the campaign against Japanese shipping had achieved its ultimate, terrifying objective. The strategy of economic strangulation was complete. Japan was not merely weakened. It was a nation being systematically ground to a halt, its industrial heart stilled, its military a skeletal force, and its society teetering on the brink of collapse. The hidden killer and its allied forces had moved beyond severing arteries. They were now suffocating the very organism of the state. The final act was not a battle, but an asphyxiation. The most palpable symbol of this final strangulation was the condition of the Japanese Imperial Navy. The mighty combined fleet, which had once projected power across half the globe, no longer existed as a functional fighting force. Its surviving capital ships, the carriers, battleships, and heavy cruisers, were immobilized in the inland sea, hidden in remote coves and anchorages like Kure and Hashirajima. They were not being preserved for a decisive battle. They were simply out of fuel. Their crews, listless and demoralized, were often reassigned to shore duty or infantry units. These floating fortresses had been rendered into nothing more than static, heavily defended anti-aircraft platforms. When American carrier aircraft finally located and attacked them in July 1945, it was less a naval battle and more a systematic demolition of stranded, immobile targets. The destruction of the battleship Haruna and the carrier Amagi was the sinking of museum pieces, the final footnote to a naval war already won by the submarine campaign. On the home islands, the industrial pulse grew fainter with each passing week. Factories, starved of raw materials, operated in fits and starts. The production of civilian goods had long since ceased, and now even military production was a shadow of its former self. The manufacture of aircraft, the one weapon Japan desperately needed for defense, was crippled. Airframes were produced without engines, engines without propellers, and aircraft without radios or armament. The qualitative decline was as severe as the quantitative one. The Jinrai, Divine Thunder, Special Attack Units, the Kamikaze, were often flying obsolete trainers or hastily constructed aircraft made from non-strategic materials like wood, with performance so poor they were little more than guided, crude missiles. This was not a choice born of tactical innovation, but of sheer, absolute material desperation. The most profound and terrifying consequence of the strangulation was the impending famine. Japan had always been dependent on imported food, particularly rice from Korea and Formosa. With the merchant fleet annihilated and the sea lanes utterly dominated by American forces, these imports dried up. The 1945 rice harvest within Japan was disastrous, hampered by a lack of fertilizer, which had also been imported, and the mobilization of the agricultural workforce. The government ration, already meager, was cut to starvation levels. The average caloric intake for a Japanese citizen fell to below 1,500 calories per day, a level that sustains only basic biological functions and leads to severe physical and mental decline. People were reduced to eating acorns, sawdust, and weeds. Urban populations, utterly dependent on the broken distribution system, began to starve. The social fabric, stretched taut by years of war and propaganda, began to fray. The authority of the state was being undermined by the most primal of human needs, hunger. This comprehensive collapse created a surreal and horrific reality in the final months of the war. American submarines operated with near total impunity in Japan's home waters, even penetrating the sea of Japan itself in a daring series of raids in June 1945. They surfaced in broad daylight to shell coastal installations and sink fishing boats with their deck guns. The sight of an enemy submarine calmly patrolling just miles from the shore was the ultimate symbol of a nation that had lost control of its own perimeter. The skies, too, belonged to the enemy. American B-29 superfortresses roamed at will, mining harbors and firebombing cities with no fear of interception from a vanquished air force. The nation was, for all intents and purposes, defeated. Its military could not maneuver, its industry could not produce, and its people could not eat. The leadership in Tokyo, however, remained trapped in a fatalistic paralysis, unwilling to accept the reality that was visible in every empty harbor, every silent factory, and every hungry face. They spoke of a decisive battle on the home islands, a national suicide that would extract such a high cost in American blood that a negotiated peace might still be possible. But this was a fantasy. The army could muster millions of men, but they were armed with little more than bamboo spears, antique rifles, and indoctrinated spirit. They had no fuel for trucks, no ammunition for sustained combat, and no food to feed their soldiers. The final strangulation was thus a physical and psychological state. Japan was a ghost of a nation, its body emaciated and its spirit broken by a war it could no longer wage. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were a horrific, dramatic punctuation to a sentence that had already been written. They provided the shock that broke the political deadlock in Tokyo. But the war had already been won in the deep waters of the Pacific. The nation had been ground to a halt not by a single cataclysmic blow, but by the slow, relentless, and utterly complete constriction of its economic life. The hidden killer had finished its work. The empire was dead. It just had not yet been buried. In the grand, sweeping narratives of World War II, victory is often attributed to the colossal land battles on the Eastern Front, the daring amphibious assaults of the Normandy landings, or the revolutionary carrier duels of the Pacific. These were the visible, dramatic hinges of fate upon which history turned. Yet a strong argument can be made that the single most decisive campaign of the entire war, the one that most directly and efficiently broke the back of an enemy nation, was waged not by armies of millions, but by a few thousand men in a silent service, employing a weapon of devastating simplicity. The unseen victor of the Pacific War was not a famous general or a secret superweapon. It was the American submarine and its reliable torpedo. To claim a weapon won the war is to invite scrutiny. The Pacific victory was, of course, a monumental combined effort. The Marines and soldiers who bled for every inch of coral and jungle, the naval aviators who won control of the skies, and the sailors who manned the surface fleet all played indispensable roles. But their efforts were enabled and their victories accelerated by a campaign that neutralized the enemy's fundamental strength and exposed his core weakness. The submarine campaign was the strategic constant, the unrelenting pressure that made every other Allied victory possible and every Japanese defeat inevitable. Consider the alternative. What if the U.S. torpedo had worked perfectly from December 7th, 1941? The historical evidence provided by the 1944 to 1945 tonnage statistics suggests a chilling timeline. Japan's merchant fleet would have likely been halved by the end of 1943 rather than mid-1944. The oil crisis would have struck a year earlier, grounding the Luftwaffe's equivalent in the Pacific long before the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese carrier pilots lost at Midway would have been irreplaceable far sooner. The industrial collapse would have begun in 1943, drastically reducing the equipment and ammunition available to Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. The war-winning island-hopping campaign would have met a far weaker, less supplied, and less mobile enemy. The war might have ended in 1944, saving countless American and Japanese lives. This is the counterfactual weight of the torpedo scandal. The 2-year delay imposed by a faulty weapon arguably prolonged the conflict and cost untold lives. But once fixed, the submarine's impact was swift and absolute. It was a weapon that perfectly matched the strategic problem. Japan was an island empire whose very existence and war-making capacity depended on the sea. The submarine was the perfect instrument to exploit this vulnerability. It was a strategic weapon par excellence. Its success stands in stark contrast to other celebrated campaigns. The combined bomber offensive against Germany, for all its cost and bravery, never succeeded in completely halting German war production, which continued to increase in 1944. The U-boat campaign against Britain, while terrifyingly effective for a time, was ultimately defeated by Allied technology and tactics. The American submarine campaign against Japan, however, was never defeated. It only grew in lethality until it had achieved total victory in its assigned theater. It sank more than half of all Japanese merchant tonnage and a third of the Imperial Japanese Navy's warships. The submarine was the unseen victor because it operated in the realm of logistics, the unglamorous but decisive foundation of all warfare. It did not just defeat the enemy's army. It made it impossible for that army to exist in a modern, industrial context. It turned the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, which Japan had hoped would be a defensive moat, into an impassable desert. Every tanker sunk in the South China Sea meant fewer sorties for Zeros over the Philippines. Every freighter sent to the bottom carrying bauxite meant one less bomber to challenge the B-29s over Tokyo. Every troop transport destroyed meant a garrison left to wither, bypassed, and irrelevant. The legacy of this campaign is a timeless lesson in military strategy. It demonstrates that victory is not always about destroying the enemy's fielded forces in a climactic battle. Often, it is about identifying and ruthlessly exploiting a critical vulnerability in the enemy's system, their economy, their logistics, their very ability to sustain a fight. The American submarine force did not win its war with a single glorious charge. It won with 1,000 patient, deadly strikes in the dark. It won by ensuring that the Japanese Empire, for all its martial fervor and tactical bravery, was ultimately fighting on an empty stomach, with empty fuel tanks and with empty factories. In the end, the most powerful weapon was not the one that made the loudest explosion, but the one that created the most profound silence. It was the silence in the Japanese shipyards that could not replace the lost tonnage. It was the silence in the fuel depots that held only vapors. It was the silence in the stomachs of the people. This was the victory of the unseen killer, a victory delivered not from the skies or the beaches, but from the cold, dark, and silent depths.